So what do we do now?
Well, Gurvinder. Yeah, so I thought what we do is, because you've never really tasted any Quebecois wines,
Correct.
we do a kind of small tasting and see what you think about the region, because we've recently been doing a lot of stories about the region, and in fact, the December issue, Domaine Saint-Jacques, the one I'm pouring you right now, is on the cover. And I think we're at a point now in Quebec, we're 3 or 4 years away from proving that vinifera can be done well here. Now, I unfortunately couldn't find a lot of vinifera wines. These are all mostly hybrids. So let's get your first impressions of these 3 wines.
Okay. And, I think it's important to recognize that, with any emerging wine region, the fact that more people are talking about it, that in of itself, is reason enough to give it some attention. So I think it's important that we become familiar with it, and this is interesting because, particularly out west, we don't get access to any Quebec wines at all, in fact. And of recent, I haven't been out here enough to taste them, so this is good. This is, and it says 100% Vidal. Okay.
This is a great comparison, because now when you look at it, Vidal is something that Ontario has banked on for quite a long time. So, and you've tasted, I'm sure, a number of really good Vidals, being Quench's winery.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because for the most part, because in British Columbia they grow Vidal as well, and in Ontario, of course, they grow Vidal. Most producers seem that they're using Vidal for either ice wine or late harvest. Right, so there's not that many producers that are doing it as a dry still wine, which this is, and it's rather pleasant. I mean, it's a simple wine, has nice texture, it's quite drinkable, has nice freshness to it. Not a lot of complexity, but I don't think that's necessarily a knock. I think when we look at emerging wine regions, when we get to the stage where the wines are drinkable, generally complexity is not something that occurs right away. Complexity is something that, as the region evolves and the producers become more familiar with their vineyard sites and are able to work the vineyard sites more, and even in terms of the production itself. So I think simple drinkability is a good sign in a young wine region.
A wine like this, Vidal tends towards high acidity at times, but you're finding the acidity to be...
I don't think it's necessarily high acidity in this at all. I mean, I think it's rather, the acidity is there, but it's rather soft. Part of that has to do, I think, with the texture. I mean, Vidal, one of the reasons it's used for ice wine is because it's a fairly hardy grape. And so with that, you will get that, almost, because the skins will give it a little bit more of texture in the mouth. And so I think with this particular wine, you get that textural component that Vidal often has.
Let's go on to the next one. It's Domaine Saint-Bernard. And this is a blend, definitely. And again, it's a hybrid blend.
Yeah, and looks like it doesn't specify what those grapes are. So just by the nose of it, I would guess that it's a blend of hybrids, because it's just a little bit more alcoholic, a little bit more foxy on the nose, and that foxiness is fairly typical for hybrids. I mean, it's definitely a wine that is probably less elegant than the first one. A little bit more of a punch to it, much more of a overt, stronger flavor in terms of that wild character. Yeah, but interesting. I mean, it's not an offensive wine.
I think that should be their tagline from now on. I'm not insulting anybody with this wine.
Exactly. It would be nice to know, though. I think it's important if you want to draw attention to a region. I think it's important that instead of saying this is a blend of grapes, that you actually identify what those grape varieties are, whether they're hybrids or vinifera. I think it's important that you make that clear, because otherwise, I mean, the consumer is tasting with no context whatsoever.
Be proud of where you're from.
Exactly. Okay.
Now, this one here is Domaine Saint-Jacques. They've been making a lot of waves recently throughout Quebec, but this is their reserve version of their Dedan.
And this is very typical in terms of evolution in particularly emerging cool climate areas, where this is a blend of the Frontenac Blanc, Céval Blanc, Vidal, and Chardonnay. So you have a blend of hybrids along with vinifera. Nice mouthfeel. Again, has that. I would draw these two wines in terms of the sense of clean, well-made, drinkability. Again, not necessarily a lot of complexity. This one definitely has more complexity than the Vidal does, but you don't get the foxiness, you don't get the wildness that you do from this particular wine, which I'm guessing is completely hybrids. This one shows to me that there's probably a certain amount of skill that is going into both in terms of what they're doing in the vineyard as well as what they're doing in the winery. So, I mean, in many ways, this reminds me of most emerging wine regions. And if you compare this to the Okanagan from 25 years ago, 30 years ago, if you compare it to some of the northern areas in BC right now, like around Kamloops and the Shuswaps. Shuswaps, I think, is actually a really good comparison, because in the Shuswaps, they are predominantly using hybrids still, but they have been working with them for so many years, and they're actually doing a pretty good job, particularly a couple of wineries in particular, and they are able to bring in and grow some vinifera that is actually doing well in the area. I think the key is, whenever you have a cool climate area, it's to figure out what grapes grow best in those areas and make those wines from that, because we tend to go through the same kind of process, I think, and we see the same kind of evolution, where the first thought is we should make wine from grapes that people like to drink. And that's not necessarily, in fact, it's rarely the best thing to do, because you can't grow Cabernet in areas that are cool, cold climate. Then the next thought is, okay, let's make wines that we like to drink ourselves, which again isn't necessarily intuitive, because doesn't mean necessarily we're planting the grapes that are appropriate for that area. Once we get to the stage where we are A, planting the proper grapes, B, understand the terroir, the soils and the microclimates, and C, the wine production, vineyard management and wine production in those areas evolves to the stage where they really understand what they have, how best to use it, and how best to make wine from that. Then I think we see the stage where the wines can actually be, take that next step from something that's, okay, a novelty, to something that is actually drinkable and commercially viable.
So you drank these three wines right now, which I chose as a cross-section of what we're producing in Quebec. Do you get a sense of place from these three wines?
A sense of place? I don't think so. I think I get the sense that these wines are from emerging areas. So I don't necessarily get a sense of what that place is. And partly that's because I haven't tasted enough wines from the area. So I think that's one thing. I think the youth of the region is also another factor, because the wines are rather simple. And this one has, I think, a little bit more complexity to it in terms of there's more going on in here. The area, A, may be too young to really have a sense of place. And B, me in this instance, hasn't tasted enough wines from the area to really understand what that sense of place actually is.
That's really important to say too, because no matter what, if you don't taste enough of these wines, there's no way you can make an intelligent discernment of what you're going to write in the magazine.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I can judge these wines strictly on the basis right now of tasting them. Are they well balanced? And those sorts of factors. I cannot make any comment in terms of, this is a typical wine from this particular area that the wine is being produced and the grapes are being grown. And partly is I don't know exactly where the grapes are being grown, because are these estate wineries? Are they purchasing fruit? I mean, all that comes into play and all that has a factor. So it's important to have that, I think, context when speaking and making a comment on the region itself.
Clean all the white shades in my brain. Before they make me blind, I try to track the fear inside. I hear that song, I hear that song. Stay behind. I know I will stay behind.